Hey everybody, I wanted to start a new series where I talk a bit about Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure, machine learning infrastructure, and look at it from both sides, really from an AI and an ML perspective, from the perspective of a developer, and from the perspective of somebody who's doctoral research focused on China, what the dangers are of this technology, what are the chances of it applying in other domains and other states besides China, right? I think this is where most of us are concerned about this technology. So the plan is to have a few videos on why I think this technology probably won't scale, won't transfer to other states, other domains, and then I'm going to plan on looking at it from the other perspective, saying, okay, if we do have preconditions met, how would this apply elsewhere? So really looking at where I think Chinese AI and ML technology will apply externally, in the global system, and where I think it will continue to have limitations because of what we're going to talk about today. So unfortunately, to talk about this, we have to introduce some scientific concepts. And hopefully your eyes won't glaze over too much. The first is called generalizability. And generalizability is essentially just, science jargon for can you take specific instances of some phenomenon and abstract it out to be able to classify or identify or distinguish a category that phenomenon is a part of, that specific instance is a part of. So you're taking common properties of specific examples or instances of something, and you're abstracting that out to like an idea or a concept. The way you can think about this is if I want a model that identifies dogs, right? There's all kinds of different dogs, and you want a model to be able to generalize not just to poodles or, Spitzes or something. You want the model to be able to recognize Labradors and Labradoodles and Huskies and all kinds of, miniature Schnauzers. And you also want it to be able to recognize three-legged dogs, right? You need to be able to take the instance and put it in the correct bin, even when not every single feature is there. This has been a problem in facial recognition, right? We've seen in the United States there have been controversies around poor generalizability for facial recognition models, where the model is trained only on the faces of Caucasian people, right? And then when it comes time to deploy the model, it does poorly on recognizing the faces of people of color. And so what people often kind of, I think, neglect with machine learning and artificial intelligence and the sort of application, we would think of the application of these technologies really as data science. And what people often neglect in data science is that it's science, or it should be at least. Sometimes this gets lost in the mix, but it's still, you need to have these generalizable, externally valid metrics to show that the model can generalize. So things like time, location, participant condition, investigator impacts, there's the scope and the extent of your measurement, there's the context of your measurement, there's the sample of your training data. All of these things can impact the ability of the model to generalize. And importantly, as I've talked about before in a previous video, I'll link above, these models are really good at learning and mimicking patterns within the data that they're provided. But they're still going to learn exactly what you tell them to learn, even if you're not fully aware of what you're telling them to learn. So why do we care? This is kind of boring, right? I think it is. But we care because I think fundamentally, as it relates to China and artificial intelligence, China is a very, very different place than the rest of the world.
And importantly, one of the biggest ways in which China is quite different than the rest of the world is in relation to the data and the regulatory infrastructure that's available for these kinds of tracking and facial recognition models.
By way of example, China probably has about half of the world's 800 million surveillance cameras. These are partly run, at least on the Safe Cities program, which I think was about $140 billion of investment. So between Safe Cities, a program called Skynet, unfortunately, and a program called Sharp Eyes, the Chinese government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to deploy these kinds of cameras to monitor their population. And the goal here between these programs is essentially seamless monitoring of all public space in the country. An estimate I saw from around, I think it was 2017, indicated that they were probably around $350 billion in PPP terms on internal security spending. That was about twice what the United States spends. And for a few years, we've seen a lot of China watchers note that China actually spends quite a bit more on internal security than they do on external security. This is almost unheard of. So in some future videos, I'm going to hit on the social credit system and other elements of the sort of totalitarian techno state that the PRC has constructed. But for now, I think it's enough to just sort of start to ask this question, right? Does this kind of a system generalize? I think people often have the cart before the horse on the dangers of artificial intelligence because the models are not the part of this that's leading the totalitarianism, right? The models are an adjunct that are helping the party state enforce rules, monitor people, but this only follows the outlaying of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and the construction of this observational state with almost no civil society oversight, no regulatory oversight, no civil society resistance, no public sector or nonprofit resistance. There's no enforceable Bill of Rights or anything like that. There's no general data protection regime. There's no consumer protection in the sense that we would think about it even in the United States, not to mention Europe, right? So this is all to say the factor that's really pushing Chinese techno-totalitarianism isn't the techno part of it, it's the totalitarianism part of it. So obviously this has, huge negative ramifications for people in China, right? Especially ethnic groups like the Uyghurs, like the Tibetans, like the Mongolians in Inner Mongolia. These areas in particular have been used as test beds for this technology. I mean, people in these areas are monitored constantly. But the idea that you see, I think, increasingly in the media that this kind of technology can just be ported over to Uganda or Virginia or Croatia. This isn't really true, right? Because what needs to exist before that are the hundreds of millions of cameras. It is the millions and millions of dollars spent for a central operating picture kind of control room that you see in Shanghai or Hangzhou. These cities have incredibly expensive and well developed monitoring systems staffed by dozens and dozens or hundreds of people, right, who are all paid by the government from that 300-400 billion dollars of internal security spending.
So what we see here really is that we need both the operational infrastructure and the regulatory infrastructure for these systems to generalize to other polities, to other states in the global system. And while this isn't the same thing as a statistical restriction on generalizability in the sense that, the output of a model transferring from one context to another because of some internal limitation to what the model has learned statistically, it actually doesn't matter. It's the same result, right? You can't have these models work in practice without the actual observational infrastructure in place, the tracking infrastructure in place, as well as what we see in China, which is essentially an unfettered legal and statutory ability to collect this data on people and use it as the government sees fit.
So the first problem that you can see with generalizability, right, and external validity is unless you have that infrastructure, these models are not going to be functional or operate appropriately. The other issue, obviously, right, is that these things have to be trained on something. So this again comes back to, how do we ensure that this doesn't happen in anywhere else but China, right? This is where it comes back to civil protection, civil liberties, civil society groups. This is where it comes back to open regulatory environments where the regulatory state in the United States or in the EU, these meetings, these regulatory structures need to be supervised and publicly available. And this really is the big picture idea, right? Is that on one end of this sort of technology spectrum, you have the Chinese state, where the data of the individual essentially is the property of the state from the moment it's created. So as soon as your personhood enters the digital realm, it is monitored, controlled, and ultimately owned by the party state. On the other side of this, you have the general data protection regime kind of concept in the EU, which is really the other polarity of a way to deal with data as a human right, as a policy at a policy level, thinking of, hey, this data still belongs to the individual. Nothing has happened there in the generation of it that means that data should belong to anyone else but that individual. So we should promulgate decisions about how that data is used to the individual. And this is obviously a very Western perspective with deep roots in sort of Western individualism, and obviously contrasts quite starkly to a sort of a more communitarian Chinese perspective, which is as long as the usage of that data is towards harmony and safety and to promote the security and stability of the community of which that individual is a part, well, that really falls into something where that usage is acceptable to broadly speaking to that community, right? So the roots of this generalizability problem are political, they're also cultural. So I think the takeaway is this is really one of those, the more things change, the more they say the same kind of issues, where obviously we have real concerns with this technology. We need to supervise it appropriately. We have a ton of outstanding questions about the ethics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. But if we want to guard against the totalitarian use of this technology, we need to guard against totalitarianism. The ultimate core of these models is the data, and the ultimate core of the data is getting access to it and generating it, right? So the concern to me is less sort of like the inherent dangers of a convolutional neural net that's able to recognize faces, and more, has your government unilaterally deployed a system of hundreds or thousands of cameras that are monitoring you at all times without your consent? And can they take that data of you and do with it what they will because of the legal and policy structures in place in your country or state of residence? That's the core of the problem, and why it's so important to continue to contest and debate and fight for an implementation of these technologies that is compatible with individual liberty, that is compatible with sort of a human rights perspective on the world, and is compatible with liberal democracy. And really, I think this is why it's critical that we continue to develop these technologies and work to do it in a way that is part of that other polarity of data usage of machine learning applications, more in line with a European general data protection regime kind of approach, because we need to provide an alternative both for our own societies and obviously the developing world to demonstrate that these technologies can be used in a pro-social way. They can be used in compatibility with and agreement with individual liberty and privacy. We need to have that alternative. Otherwise, it will be easier to sell the sort of techno-totalitarian version of this. That's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, this is the first of a few videos in this series that I'll keep kind of talking about Chinese artificial intelligence and machine learning technology, and I really appreciate you taking a look. Thanks.